Hey all, this talk was previously done as part of an online event for the University of London. That does also include a Q&A session, which I'll signpost in the description and on the screen as well. It is one story that sits within a broader PhD study about Caribbean communities in Northamptonshire in the UK, in that post-war period from 1948 up to the mid 1980s in 1985. This talk actually does take us after um, the end of my study, actually. So it takes us up to 1995. But most of the research, all the research I'm doing for Caribbean people in Northamptonshire or our communities is up to 85. Um, and no doubt what you hear in this talk is by far an incomplete narrative since most history is not definite. I've also linked a Padlet document in the description to sources I've used in this talk and also wider reading and so on, that some of you may find of interest as well. For those of you who are watching this internationally or nationally, um, Northampton is a town in Northamptonshire, a county in the Midlands within the country of England, about an hour from London to the south and an hour from Birmingham to the north, largely drawn from interviews um, with those who came here from the Caribbean as children in the 50s and 60s, those born here to Caribbean parents in those very same years, and also their English friends. This paper or lecture talk discusses Northampton's Matta Fancanta youth movement as a addition to the city narratives of Black activism within the UK in that post-war period. Um, my name is Trey Ventour-Griffiths, and I'm a UK Northampton-based creative and scholar whose work can be broadly contained within Black history, neurodiversity, the arts, criticism, and insurgent politics. I'm also raised in Northampton, and my family has been in the area since the early 60s as well. For context, my PhD is a creative writing PhD, and not a history PhD. My working title is Northamptonshire is the place for me, creative responses to provincial England's Caribbean diaspora, 1948 to 1985. I'm using oral history testimonies. So last year I did approximately 120 interviews in an 8-month period across 3 generations of people. So the um, Caribbean folks who came to Northampton and Wellingborough as adults in the 60s and the 50s, um, those who came as children in those very same years, and also, so I guess first generation British Caribbean people born in this country that grew up in Northampton and Wellingborough, or the county in those periods. So people who were born here, who remember either the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the early 80s. And I am mixing those testimonies with limited secondary sources, so things like history books and other sources like news media, for example, from the time, which you'll see in this talk as well, because I've got quite a few clippings from the Chronicle and Echo about MFM. And I'm using those to produce a creative nonfiction PhD, so true stories with a literary flair. Generally, in this lecture and my wider PhD research, I'm using interviews to help me to tell a wider story of Caribbean Northants. What you hear this afternoon, or whatever time you're watching this from, will be what some participants have told me of their experiences, but really streamlined into a more storytelling format to fill in the gaps of what is unsaid. As I was told by one academic friend and colleague, you are not simply managing data, you are developing a perspective about that data. There are over 80 members of the Matta Fancanta youth movement, and probably hundreds, if not thousands more who attended events and used the building in whatever capacity over the years. This talk is based on a very tiny fraction of that. And I've also supplemented this story with wider reading materials as well. Amid what has been termed as Black British activism, and I use that term in air quotes, popular activist stories in the UK remain focused on big English cities. Whether we are talking about the backstory to Notting Hill Carnival in London, um, or the 1963 Bristol bus boycott, or even the opening of Handsworth Cultural Centre in 1978 Birmingham, or even the underlying reasons for uprisings against police in many English cities in the 70s and 80s. But my PhD is also auto-ethnographic, so ethnography being the study of culture and auto being the self, hence terms like autobiography. Hence, autoethnography means using personal experiences to discuss cultural experiences. So my mum's family, so the Ventours and the Noels um, in Northampton, all in large came from the parish of St. John's in Grenada. Specifically, my maternal great grandparents, Toyley and Edison Noel, were in Northampton from 1962. My mum's dad, Grandad Sarge, is also one of 11, and his brother, Uncle Albert, came to England in 1955, and remarked by my grandfather and their sister, Auntie Kay, at the same year as Hurricane Janet. Auntie Rosie was in Northampton from the early 60s and worked as an auxiliary nurse in the NHS. Their sisters, Auntie Bet and Auntie Kay, are both settled in London as well. Um, Uncle Albert, Auntie Bet, Auntie Kay, Auntie Rosie, and my grandfather came from a family whose background was in farming, and everything they ate came from the land. And back in the village, everybody knew each other. So when they got here, Grenadians in Northampton found each other as they did in London. So for many families that came from the rural areas of the Caribbean and to settle in big, bustling major cities, it must have been a disorientating experience for some, which may have made towns like Northampton and Wellingborough appealing. So, in focusing on the major cities, I think there's a forgotten rural heritage of those early Caribbean arrivals at risk of being lost. My PhD is autoethnographic as well, so ethnography being the study of culture, auto being the focuses on the self. So, using personal experience to discuss cultural experiences as well. Um, and I'm now the fourth generation of my family to have grown up in Northampton, starting from 1962. So I plot this lecture from Northants as home and personal, and the term Tallawah, so from the title of this lecture, means we're small but mighty. And Matta Fancanta and the Matta Fancanta youth movement, I think, embodies that as well. So here I do focus on the experiences of black men and their lives. Though I'm well aware black women had their own experiences in the very male-dominated Rastafarian space in the 70s and 80s. These young men who led that organization were Caribbean by birth and descent. Matta Fancanta, known locally as MFM or movement, defined many people of that generation, not only through roots reggae music, but also through sports teams and also professional development opportunities, including with reprographic printing and electronics, and I'll discuss in a minute. And this talk really discusses both quite generally and very specifically as well. Primarily, MFM, as it was known, was an alternative to the local youth provision, catering to the specific cultural needs of Caribbean young people in Northampton. But it did have wider appeal. First coined in the 70s, the term Matta Fancanta comes from the Wolof and Amharic languages to mean come guard or save yourself from self-destruction, um, meaning save yourself, preserve yourself from the outside forces like Babylon, like the police and racist employers. As many members were also Rastafarian, this also made many fluent in the cultural language of Rastafari, which talked about institutions like the police and really this institution of whiteness as Babylon and Africa as Zion. The return to Africa for many members was something that was always considered. For example, Lee Bryant went to the Gambia in 1974, 75, and came back, which I'll discuss in a minute. For people like Ras Jabulani, aka Trevor Hall, who I interviewed as well as Lee, and also Ira Moven, notions of Africa echoed Marcus Garvey, and it was like a homecoming. Uncle Ira, as I know him and call him, told me on going to Ghana, he was told welcome home. He came to Northampton as a child from Nevis in 1970, and likewise, Trevor is also based now on the African continent. Matta Fancanta's origin stories speak to that, making it also stigmatized by many church-going Caribbean elders, many of them now recognizable in media imagery of Black people stepping off ships and BOAC planes, dressed in nice suits and beautiful dresses. The story of Matta Fancanta is important not only as part of my local history, but also that of a wider Midlands, broader English and British history as well, and also histories of the Caribbean. So much Caribbean history happened outside of the Caribbean in the diaspora. Dominant focuses on London and other big cities have eclipsed other sites of Caribbean settlement, like in Bedford, for example, Huddersfield, Basingstoke, Doncaster, Rugby, Leicester, and Derby. All of these places were mentioned in my interviews with elders. The exclusion of Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland also refocuses large English cities as the centre. Small and big towns, minor cities, coast, and what literary critic Corinne Fowler calls the green and pleasant land. So there's Corinne Fowler and her book, The Green and Pleasant Land. Um, so the green and pleasant land of the countryside remains an enigma, and representations of Caribbean people in post England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Towns like Wellingborough and Northampton in England were such sites. For example, when my family first got here in 1962, they were not alone. Between 1948 and 1970, many arrived here from the Caribbean, from islands like Barbados, Kitts and Nevis, Montserrat, Jamaica, Grenada, St. Vincent, Trinidad, and many more, looking for work, following family members who'd come here previously, and also pursuing more affordable housing than what was offered in the big cities. Before long, there were Black Caribbean communities in Northampton and Wellingborough, where everyone knew each other. In Kettering as well, there were fewer families from the 60s, further to a presence in villages like Isham from the 70s, and also Beaujert in 1980, which is a village just outside of Wellingborough. Um, Matter Fancanta is about the children of the earlier generation. It's a story of Black Caribbean youngsters doing it for themselves in what was a relatively provincial area. Here we might think of films and TV shows as another site where Black historical narratives are produced. Um, these sorts of texts over the past 50 years have influenced public opinion too, from films like Pressure by Horace Ove in 1976 about the British Black Panther movement in London, through to Babylon about sound system, to Burning an Illusion, Hands with Songs, Young Soul Rebels, Desmond's, set in a Peckham barber shop, The Real McCoy, and also most recently things like Rye Lane and Dreaming Whilst Black that centralise big English cities, most notably London. Likewise, stories of the Indian experience in the Caribbean, so Indian Caribbean people, and also Chinese Caribbean have willfully been ignored in countries like Jamaica, Trinidad, and St. Vincent, for example. Black experiences of post-war Brixton and Notting Hill have become the knowledge centre that media tell swathes of their post-war historical Caribbean narrative. So England, but very much London and port cities like Liverpool and Bristol have become the place where blackness, to varying degrees, has become legitimised. Matter Fancanta challenges this city knowledge, bringing provincial Northants into the picture as another site of Black experiences, also one whose existence in large came from the African continent, especially the Gambia. The dominant mainstream has introduced us to characters like Claudia Jones and Darcus Howe in the London context. But what about provincial Black communities? though I'm not always in favour of the biographizing of Black British history, so the focus on individuals, I have done so in this paper to show what other characters there were. However, if you want to see my thoughts on this in more detail, um, and the problems with this Black excellence narrative and the individualizing of history, I did write a paper on it for an organization called Race Reflections. And the paper is called The House of Black Excellence, excellence with an X rather than EX, Monument Culture and the Spectacularized Black British Past. In 1974-75, a group of black men drove from Knightsbridge in London to the Gambia on the African continent. One of these men was Lee Bryant. Came to London as a child from Jamaica in 1959, moving to Northampton in the early 70s as a young adult. In the Gambia, he was inspired by young people on a beach. And I say young because none of them were older than 18 years old, but were running a youth centre, a community youth centre. His experiences changed his perceptions of what responsibility can look like. If these children could run a centre, why couldn't black young people do it in Northampton? This is in part what led to the formation of MFM, Matta Fancanta, or movement, including the many conversations in people's houses. For example, on his return, Lee's house, which was in the Lumber Tubs area, and then he moved up to Palmerston Road, were filled with people for weeks wanting to know about Africa. It was then suggested by a black American man called Julian that they could possibly squat a place. In those days, Lee was a Rastafarian, and his trip to the Gambia was life changing. Similarly, Trevor Hall, aka Ras Jabulani, who came to Northampton as a child from Gloucester, which also had its own Caribbean community in the 50s and 60s. Um, Likewise, Duku, who also came from Jamaica as a child, they all now live in different areas of the African continent. As Stuart Hall has argued, that Rastafarianism necessitated an adapting of blackness via a rediscovery of Africa. But also, let's discuss what else was happening around the time in the years leading up to MFM as well. On the 25th of June 1972, a young Bob Marley played as a warm-up act for Johnny Nash at a club on Bridge Street called Shades. A 1973 concert on the 22nd of May at King's Heath's Fantasia Club also brought Bob Marley back to Northampton with the Wailers, reportedly one of their first gigs in England outside of a major English city. On the 30th of November 1973, they played again at what became the University of Northampton, and I think this was just the Wailers without Bob Marley. I think Bob Marley was sick that night as well, so it was just the Wailers. The latter gigs were also part of the Catch a Fire tour and would have been many local people's first exposure to Rastafarianism, especially young black people born in this country, and Bob Marley's iconic aesthetic. Songs like Slave Driver and 400 Years emphasized Africanness and the diaspora consciousness, and that album might have been a first for marketing of that kind, making Rasta popular. When I interviewed Andy Savage, a white guy that came to Northampton from Burton-on-Trent in 1970, I sensed that this was a first even for him, coming from a place where there was already a strong Caribbean community that he had been exposed to through the blues party scene and elsewhere. He wasn't a stranger to Caribbean culture, but Bob Marley coming was another force entirely unto himself. By 1970, um, a young Trevor Hall became Ras Jabulani, was 13, and a selector DJ in Northampton. His uncle was the famous Count Shelley, who owned Third World Records and London's Count Shelley Sound in Top. That sound was later brought out by Trevor with Duku and the late Eddie White in what was probably around 1973-74. That time you also had Count Shelley, Jar Shaka, Coxon, Batman, Duke, Reed, Quaker City, and many other sounds across the country. Big Youth's album, Screaming Target, had released in 1972, and there were also local sounds. I was told about Jar Chalice in Wellingborough, and also later on, a Sisters of Love in Northampton run by local black women. Additionally, sounds like Bassatone by the Cranstons and Tech One by Devon Parks and others. Jar U also played one of his early gigs at Steps Youth Club on Kingswell Street. Um, Locally, this was a great time for youth culture. Anti-oppression work was championed by teenagers and young adults through the music. And in the middle of that, you had the pre-release 45 singles, the latest pre-release 45s from Jamaica, that could be found at a record spinner disc. Sound system in Northampton defined a generation that did a lot to reduce racial barriers that in some cases have re-emerged back today. Reggae music also joined hands with the punk movement, and local black venue Matta Fancanta did hire out its space to punks who, like many of the Caribbean youth, were anti-system. Like those that movement, punk offered alternative ways of life to mainstream rules and norms, opposing mainstream ideologies, authority culture, consumerism, and corporations, inspiring freedom to act, think, how we like outside of standardized ways. The time MFM and national punk movements existed was also a time of global recession and high levels of unemployment. By 1977, punk scene in England embraced roots reggae, much to the surprise of Michael Riley, who was in Birmingham based reggae band Steel Pulse. Now an academic in Black British music, in the documentary by Akala, Roots Reggae Rebellion, Michael recollects how many of these white punks truly understood what roots reggae was talking about, including the disenfranchisement of the system. In the music, at least, young people were leading the way, and locally, this also manifested in local youth clubs. Um, this extract from Who Killed Mr. Moonlight by David J. Haskins describes what Bauhaus founded in Northampton thought about MFM. They said at the time, Northampton had a large Rastafarian population centered around the Matta Fancanta youth movement, which had its base at the Old Salvation Army Citadel on the corner of Sheep Street. It was run by Trevor Hall, whose uncle had started the famed Count Shelley sound system. They would hold monthly events featuring two outfits competing against each other, spinning dub plates, instrumental tracks direct from Jamaica, and placing them huge speakers, over huge speakers, while their respective toasters took turns freestyling over the top. They would really go to town, painting up the entire place in the red, gold, and green, or red, green, and gold, as they said, and wearing the suits and outsized hats to match, while the women would dye their hair. There were quotations from Haile Selassie all around the walls, and the air was thick with ganja smoke, gamey aroma of goat's head soup. There was never any trouble, quite the opposite, and the amazing music that we heard in that place became a big influence on us. Bela Lugosi's Dead being a good example. But yeah, this is what they thought about MFM. Similarly, at that time you had on Clare Street, there was also Persuaders Youth, run by Leo Walker, Joyce Eubanks, and Beverly Chisholm. It was Caribbean run, and most of the kids that went there were of Caribbean backgrounds as well. Likewise, as I said earlier, on Kingswell Street there were steps run by a white guy called Tom. Tom running steps also allowed many black youths somewhere to go. Persuaders Youth Club later folded due to lack of community support from parents, and Steps also folded as well. And most of the young people that went to Steps then went to MFM. That transition was pretty seamless. In 1973, a young and motivated Sarah Berry came to Northampton to take a job as the Assistant Community Relations Officer with what was then called Northampton Council for Community Relations. She was joined by a man called Pascal Plummer in 1974, who came from Wolverhampton, who was originally from Jamaica, he himself coming from Wolverhampton as a child. In 65, earlier, The newly prior introduced Race Relations Act, which on paper criminalised racism in public spaces, led to the formation of the Community Race Council Board, which greenlit funding to construct many community relations councils across England, such as in Northampton and Wellingborough, with characters like Ivan Bryan and Walker as well, both from Jamaica. They and Sarah also conducted surveys about Black aspirations in schools, interviewing many Black students. This survey led to the formation of the West Indian Parents Association in 1974. A 1977 article from the Chronicle and Echo quotes Sarah, then a CRC officer, saying MFM are members of the Community Relations Council, and they approached us some months ago for assistance in obtaining premises. We subsequently took the local authority for information in general and also specific information about the Salvation Army building, but were informed that no suitable premises were available. I'm sure that everyone in the community welcomes constructive efforts by this group of young people to take responsible steps to help themselves. That article continues to discuss how Sarah supported them, but also the fact some others in the local Northampton community did too, at least vocally. Such people included Reverend Harry Whitaker, who at the time was leader of the Northamptonshire Association of Youth Clubs. Um, Marcia, as well, was around at that time, um, and she was a founding member of West Indian Parents Association. And she said that I moved up from London on a job in '73 to teach at Cliftonville Boys High School. And at the same time, there was a lot going on around educationally subnormal. This had been going on for some time where the remit was about Black people, subnormal, not having the educational ability, needing extra support to learn. Um, and I expect many of the children that were helped by West Indian parents later on were the ones who went, in many cases, went to MFM, the ones who have been unfairly victimized by the state, even though um, they were able and intelligent children. But because many of them, because they were Black, um, they were excluded from school at that time as well. Many of them Black and from the Caribbean. So Um, the West Indian Parents Association were responding to the subnormal scandal of the late 60s and early 70s, effectively state violence in education. Um, Many of the children acting out um, were so-called non-compliant. They were actually educationally further ahead than what they were being taught. Apparently, as Sarah told me, many of the kids from Barbados. And I expect many of these children who had a rebellious spirit in them were the ones being called subnormal, but then the ones that also were part of MFM, quite a rebellious organization, even by today's standards and in its time as well. Um, Bored and unstimulated by the school system, many of these children acted out. However, able Black children were also being put into so-called, what I was told in interviews, remedial units. I hate that term as well. Such schools included Weavers in Wellingborough and Billingborough in Northampton, where this so-called logic of subnormality was imposed on many able children, making the West Indian Parents Association from 1974 a public necessity. This organization was founded by early founders, including Marcia Walker, Joe Dixon, Ivan Bryan, and many others. Early activities included a Saturday school, which started at Barry Road Primary. Sarah Berry came up with the idea for schools to refer children to the West Indian Parents Association, uh, children that were so called unable to learn properly, etc., etc. And West Indian Parents Association proved them wrong. Some of these children were also sent to the multicultural service to learn English as a second language. IQ tests not fit for most children, including poor white children, let alone Black children newly arrived from the Caribbean. Anyway, in the wake of that, in 1977, Black Caribbean youngsters conducted a 48-day squat of the old Salvation Army Citadel on Sheep Street in Northampton town centre. People like Lee Bryan, Trevor Hall, Pedro Samuel, Ira Moven, Job, and others were part of this original squatters crew. Job used to sleep there overnight while undercover police, um, disguised as the homeless, were trying to coax him out. What became known as movement was a self-managed space for young people's activities and professional development, an alternative to local authority youth provisions. For 48 days, they fended off the police and also the stigma somewhat from their own community. Elders, their parents, and elder Caribbean people who thought such behaviours as unrespectable and undignified. The 70s and 80s was in a time of anti-police fever across many of England's black communities, like in Birmingham, London, Manchester, Liverpool, Bristol. Northampton never had such uprisings, but that ill feeling was there because for many of the guys at movement, police harassment was a way of life. But also the fact that at that time you had numbers of people who had moved up to Northampton and Wellingborough from London as part of the so-called London overspill. And again, I hate that term to describe people. But areas of Northampton like Lings, Standon's Barn, Goldings, Thorpelands, many of those housing estates in Northampton that expanded Northampton to the east were built to cater for this new population. Similarly, from the early 60s, Queensway estate in Wellingborough was built in 62 to cater for people from London. And also Hemmingwell as well in Wellingborough, I think it was 1967, 68, that was being built as well to cater for these new populations moving north. Um, and yeah, Great London Council. There are news clippings around this as well, that, that you can research for yourself. Um, so there's a lot of talk around at that time about London being too populated, and many of these Midlands towns, called new towns, um, were marketed to Londoners as nice places to live. But anyway, um, when I talked to Pedro, who came to Northampton from St Kitts as a child during the 60s, he described how his parents would blame him for bringing the police to their door, not realizing that some police were just racist and disliked black people. It took some of the elders, so the Caribbean folks who came here as adults, um, a bit longer to realize that the police would make things up, pin on black young people. Not all police were to be reasoned with. For years during the 70s, many young black people would, especially young black men, would walk in pairs for safety, both from the police and the fascist skinheads. The introduction of sus laws in 1980, I was told, simply greenlit what police were already doing with an official stamp. It made it legal to harass black people who were criminalized for being black. People were even arrested and did prison time for crimes they did not commit or do. From the get-go, MFM's ethos of self-help did make them a target. The strange thing is that after headlines like Black Squatters Occupy Citadel, the establishment stopped threatening movement for a bit and gave them some money in the form of grants for rents and rates, classes in electronics and reprographic printing. Herbert Mackenzie, who had trained in printing at the local paper, the Chronicle and Echo, ran the printing press. The West Indian Parents Association used to get their brochures printed at MFM, and some of my participants also remembered disgruntled elders raising eyebrows and screwing up their face at the mere mention of MFM, mainly, I believe, due to the stigmas carried over from the Caribbean against Rastafarians. Electronics was run by an Englishman called Phil, who taught electronics there for years. These professional development opportunities allowed young people, especially young black people, to upskill themselves, many of whom had already been failed by the local schools, as I discussed earlier, in terms of West Indian Parents Association, subnormal scandal, and so on. With many MFM members being Rastafarian, they also faced discrimination in employment and also from their own parents as well. In his essay Negotiating Caribbean Identities, Stuart Hall wrote that Rastafarianism saved the second generation of young black people in British society. Like how Kieran Connell describes in Black Handsworth, Matta Fancanta in the Northampton context was also about freedom from oppression and resonated with many black people who had either been born and or schooled in Britain. And for those who came from Jamaica as adults in particular, they would have seen the Rasta movement firsthand, where the authorities identified Rastafarianism effectively as a cult of criminality involved in the use of cannabis and apparently bordering on madness. Um, the criminalization of Rastafarians was widespread in Jamaica. In 1930s Jamaica also saw Rastas arrested for selling pictures of Haile Selassie, or during the 60s, simply being a Rasta was a criminal offence. In the 2016 documentary Roots Reggae Rebellion, historian Caroline Cooper further tells us you take a human beings and try to turn them into objects, people resist. Jamaica is one of the countries in the Caribbean that had the most slave rebellions, so it was a constant fight. Well, Rastafari became in the early 20th century a manifestation of that spirit of resistance. So the founding of MFM by young Rastafarians in the late 70s was viewed as antagonistic to the white establishment, namely the police and the local authority, further to some of the black elders as well, and organizations led by people who came here as adults in the 50s and 60s from the Caribbean. These would have been the children of the 30s, and many may have those prejudices imposed on them from their society of that era. From a Muslim positionality, UK Bradford poet and educator Suyamaya Manzoor Khan writes about this sort of thing in a contemporary context. And I think she's onto something here as well, and with MFM. It's about respectability and constructions of respectability, um, and really just being able to just be yourself in whatever way you see fit, as long as you're not discriminating against anybody. Who are other people to tell you how you should act and not act effectively? Yeah, definitely recommend her work. Post-colonial banter is a poetry anthology, but she discusses a lot of poignant issues in there as well, including diversity and inclusion as well, in a context of whiteness and white supremacy. Um, Movement existed in a time where white supremacy pervaded mainstream employment and education that stilted black progression. This organisation was a form of activism that inspired others, including Punjabi youth in Leicester, that went on to squat the Moat Boys School in the early 80s as an alternative to local authority youth services, and Asian organisations based around religion and dominated by old men. Likewise, I was told about an elder called John who came to MFM from Oxford asking for help in doing the same over there. MFM was freedom from oppression, as many of their elder parents had arrived in England with colonial mindsets. Certainly, the behaviours of many of the church-going Christians were anti-MFM. In movement's ethos of self-help, in many ways they were alone. Little help from their parents' generation, if any, and no real help from any of the white groups either. They really did do it for themselves, and were working on a blank slate, and are really probably a good example of showing how, in cases, our elders are not always in a position to help us. The the introduction of West Indian social clubs were made in the face of racism and were in themselves activist against the colour bars that existed in mainstream clubs during the 50s, but they were not made for young people. Young people used them, but it wasn't a place they could call their own. While many of their parents did pioneer the West Indian social clubs, and Northampton's was well, I think it was the first independent West Indian social club in the country, from 1961. I was told that United Social was MFM's rival. Some of my participants who came here as children, their parents arrived in England with colonial mindsets. It warrants questioning if the decision of the elder Windrush, broadly speaking, to integrate themselves in British colonial systems like the courts, like policing, and local politics is a result of that. To many of that generation of young people, their parents' generation who ran the West Indian clubs were not community leaders. In fact, young people considered MFM more in tune with the youth. Many elders harbored prejudices against Rastafarianism and hence did so against MFM. With prejudice from the elders on one side and society on the other, they looked to themselves. In the late 70s, movement arrived in response to the violent surveillance of security in the newly built shopping complex, um, the Grosvenor Centre. I did not like black youth hanging around there. From the early 80s, police officers already targeting black people, predominantly young men, then had those actions greenlit by the state with the introduction of sus laws. Many young Rastafarians simply trying to live, not supported by their parents because they did not subscribe to many of those, I guess, Christian values, but really Victorian values, those old colonial values, opposite to the media images of well-groomed, respectable youngsters stepping off ships dressed to the nines, not knowing what awaited them in England or Britain. Now both a symbol of Britishness by institutions like the National Health Service, and also a symbol of otherness via the Home Office scandal as well. MFM did not subscribe to their parents' values, but were a productive force in the local community and wider, making connections with others who had similar problems. There was a magazine, there was fashion shows, arts and crafts, film exhibits, sports teams, African dancing workshops, Rasta education, sound system, Caribbean dances, and more. The MFM Facebook group is also an archive of memories, including the many women talking about the good old days. I also interviewed several white people who remembered going to MFM. It became a point of engagement for many young people and a hub for any young person who wanted in. It was aimed at Black youth, but it was really inclusive of anybody. Um, I remember my family friend Garfield, who came to Northampton as a child from Nevis, telling me enough white people went to MFM. And it was at MFM that he got interested in fitness, making his career as a fitness guru in Northamptonshire. Somewhere between the Caribbean and Northampton, Matta Fancanta became a hub for not only people in the UK, but many artists from Jamaica came to perform reggae music. Dennis Brown, Gregory Isaacs, Lorna G, Maxi Priest, Freddie McGregor, Frankie Paul, and Beres Hammond are a few who came to perform here. MFM had arrived with a splash where young black people, had researched squatters' rights and then squatted a building, as I said earlier. MFM became a major venue for sound system in not only Northampton but the Midlands. Tonic suits, Cecil G's, dreads, flares, tank tops, fancy jumbo collared shirts, and platform shoes, fashion, giving local people or youth avenues to express themselves, where two-tone had given way to Rasta and red, gold, and green. By the end of the 70s, it was possible to see more and more black youth congregating in the racecourse park on the edge of town as well. People were talking, and they were on a pilgrimage to belonging, a Caribbean black cultural oasis that some white folks appreciated too, a Caribbean front room out in provincial England. No one knew each other's names. It would have been nicknames or other names, like Psyche, like the Cranstons, Bones, Afro Bill, Londoner, and the list goes on. And the prior summer of 76, before the squat, was a hot one where the reggae music of the time had made an impact on how young Northamptonians saw themselves. They chatted nonsense, copied their teeth, not the establishment, the police, and made genuine connections with each other. United by the roots reggae of and the dub of King Tubby, Lee Perry, the Upsetters. They danced to Delroy Wilson, Cornell Campbell, Big U, Dillinger, Iroy, Jacob Miller, Gregory Isaacs, um, Dennis Brown, Uroy, John Holt, and the Mighty Diamonds, the Heptones. So this new generation were doing their best to hold on to their heritage. And as summer evenings turned into autumn in the late 70s, Steps, as I said earlier, was another place for youngsters to chill, dance, play, and chat, and for upcoming sounds to do battle. Most of us are exposed to various sites of historical production, whether it be films and TV programs, museum visits, and visits to historical sites, or even national holidays. And with London and other cities positioned by the media at the front of Black British knowledge making, I think to some degree we are being scammed into thinking there were no other sites like this elsewhere, especially for us out in the towns as well. So for me, especially films like Babylon, like Sound System in London, are juxtaposed to the fact that one of the major UK sounds during the 70s was in Northampton, Count Shelley. In 1977, Matta Fancanta arrived in this unsuspecting Midlands town and took the establishment and the local black organisations by surprise. Filled with entertainment and professional development, black youth upset the respectability of politics imposed by the society around them. That night in 77, 7 or 8 youngsters went to the Our Salvation Army building in Fleet Street, kicked off the door and boarded it up and waited for the police arrive to do battle. People like Lee returned from Africa with a renewed sense of education and saw many black people schooled in this country doubt their own abilities due to institutional racism. Organizations that wanted to do things were enabled by other bodies who could just as easily disable you. In the beginning, these black guys were motivated by non-material things like community, and you cannot put a price on that. By 1984, Matta Fancanta was a respected organization. However, its downfall came from the inside. MFM arrived with a bang and showed others that would try to threaten or muscle in on our town, that nobody could take Northampton because it was protected. But their first loss came due to drug and gun dealers who did not care about necessary youth and community work that was being done. They were in it for self-interest, personal gain, and really selfish reasons. They were about capitalizing on weakness of some in Northampton, as movement was infiltrated also by black police officers from the north of England, who would smoke with the guys and date local women and immerse themselves within the community. So it's quite easy to say that racism was the only reason, considering how movement started. But we must also think about the role of other black people and the flawed characters in that human experience. This was compounded by notably the misappropriation of funds, where money that was meant to be reinvested in MFM was spent on things like houses. And we know that white folks do the same thing, but grassroots community black organisations are still more scrutinised when it comes to the allocation of funding. Local funding bodies are still more hesitant to fund many black organisations. Yet thinking about the story of MFM, that is a nuanced story in many shades of grey that doesn't fit so nicely when I believe that. How black histories are told in media doesn't really allow the space for nuances of the ifs, the buts, maybes, and the questions and the human choices people make in those days out of survival, or in some cases just being selfish, where mass media are set in making monuments out of individuals. Whilst the film and TV space has told stories of our elders who arrived by ship and plane, I also want to see the stories about the shades of grey that existed and the decisions that were made based on survival, not convenient storytelling. Misappropriation of funds is the tip of the iceberg. I was also told about a court case over an alleged dodgy alcohol license, and it was all a fix up basically with that. There was there was no dodgy alcohol license. Just that side of it was just racism coming from the police and so on. MFM led to scandal in 1990, however, when it was found black officers had infiltrated, which led to the arrest of one person selling sawn-off shotguns, with those business meetings being held at the club. Also, a big drug dealing ring was reportedly broken at the club in 1991. Yet what started as a brilliant effort to mobilize young people declined into one of individuals coming to base human desires, greed, and selfishness. And even to say individuals, I think it also comes with um, racist undertones. It's very much today in the co modern context. We hear stories about police officers um, killing black people in the street, and then you see news stories of police saying it's just one bad apple. And I think it detracts from the institution. And I think in this context, there's probably the question there of the MFM that started in '77 probably wasn't the same organization in 1995. Um, and what sorts of questions were being asked within the institution at those two different times in its history. Um, it may have, culturally speaking, the culture of an institution can change over time. Um, but from that early squat, the local establishment wanted MFM to fail, and they were just looking for any reason to come at them. The Windrush elders too did not like MFM either in general, and it seems to me that both got their wish when in January 1995, bulldozers were sent in to demolish that hub of the young black community, literally in the middle of the night. This photo was taken in 2004 by a Northampton photographer, James Smith, who I met, I think it was 2019 actually, when I was a student union officer in Northampton at the University of Northampton, and it was part of a project called Absent Status. We captioned the plot, a redundant wasteland now used to house the former Matta Fancanta movement. Come guide yourself, the first black self-help centre in the country. Between 1975 and 1985, the town centre once had a thriving Caribbean community, of which the MFM Centre played a significant role. At the beginning, leading community figures like Trevor Hall, aka Ras Jabulani, helped run the centre, giving guidance in guarding yourself against self-destruction. Not only was the former Salvation Army Citadel a listed building, it was a workshop in skilled trades and a significant national tour date for international reggae and hip hop artists. The building was demolished with its entire contents, literally overnight. And I think that says a lot there about who spaces are designed, what space is defined for. Sorry, how space is defined, who it is designed for, and who it works for effectively. Um, MFM may have had the building, but the council could just come in and bulldoze it whenever they wanted, and it was listed as well. So it was a listed building. Um, and it takes a lot of people to turn the other cheek to to go and demolish a listed building like that. Stuart Hall has talked about alternative spaces for finding truth and knowledge. The corroboration of such stories have not come from the halls of academia, but local venues in my community. I've heard these stories about MFM over time. So such venues include the Lab, so the Labour Club on Charles Street in Northampton. Even at its end, the powers of that be, Babylon, I believe, was scared of an uprising and sent in bulldozers overnight. These stories, these sorts of photos show us how living blackness exists in the wake. To parrot Christina Sharp in the aftermath of chattel slavery, colonialism, out in provincial Britain. This is what whiteness can do to us, making us into ghosts, claiming we don't have any history, and then we have to prove that we do. MFM is a story that does not fit nicely on a blue plaque and also is a great example of flawed humans as history makers. There are other examples of upsetting the usual post-war Caribbean British history also, such as the good many folks who came to this country are stowaways, probably. Um, and I found as much in my interviews. There will be stories of underground criminality, abuse, and violence, not only from white people to Caribbean people, but also the what Caribbean folks did to each other when they got here. The anti-Rasta prejudice also is something that has not been properly addressed, no less than in films and TV and media. of post-war Black Britain. Um, those who live in glass houses probably shouldn't throw stones, but we never hear these stories as it inconveniences this picture of good immigrants. And even to say, were they immigrants to begin with? I would actually raise an eyebrow at that. If we talk about histories of post-war Black Britain that go against the usual film and TV depictions, what about the stories of mixedness? So the mixed Irish and Caribbean, or and the mixed English and Caribbean families. Um, Barbara Nelson, for example, born 1952, Northampton, grew up here as the child of a white woman, Phyllis Turner, and a black Jamaican man, Winston Nelson. She grew up in Northampton in the 50s and 60s and talked about the freedom of the fields around Northampton. And her parents also married her probably around 1948, 49 as well. She doesn't remember experiencing racism herself, but remembers her mother facing some of the most awful, horrific abuse for choosing to have children with a black man. Barbara and her siblings were reportedly the only mixed family in the area for some years, and she recalls that meeting more mixed heritage people came later on, as she did it in the 60s and 70s. They were always younger than her as well. Um, Her best friend as a young person was also mixed, one of the children of the African American GIs and a local white woman. Barbara also went to movement, and in those days, it was a great place to meet other people. Many of those who went to MFM born in this country also identified a lot more with the Caribbean and the African continent than with Britain. Terms like Black British were generally not things they identified with. As Paul Gilroy has said, it ain't where you're from, it's where you're at. This paper was based on original interviews I've done as part of a broader PhD study about Caribbean Northants between 1948 and 1985. It was partially influenced and based on a talk um, my cousin Weeks did last November, um, and further to interviews with people like Pedro Samuels, Ira Moven, Psyche, and the late Lee Bryan, among others, and also June Elizabeth White, Smith Gully as well. Weeks's artwork was also in the main building. The things they all did when they were 17, 18, 19, and 20 something years old, I find it all quite inspiring, in spite of all of that happened at the end. Pedro, Uncle Ira, Barbara Nelson, June Elizabeth, Trevor, Horace, and Michael Cohen, and the late Lee Bryan, among others, were part of a collective who were changed by their experiences, plus the number of white people who positively benefited from their engagement with the Black community. Further to the children who were kids in the late 80s and the early 90s who that went to MFM with their parents. For people like Don Allen, otherwise known as Psyche, it was MFM that started his long career in youth work. Weeks also did much of the artwork at MFM, later going on to found Spears Youth Theatre Company in 1985 and have a career in local film and theatre. Matta Fancanta was a starting point for many people, like in youth work, the arts, sports, and fitness, and really being well-rounded human beings above all, offering alternative representations of blackness, a narrative in Britain that has been eclipsed by major cities. Its ending does not take away the work they did, no less than how the reggae culture exposed many to different types of education, with its constant references to Africa, elevating youth consciousness. The legacy of MFM can be seen now, where there are numerous practitioners, artists, and activists in Northampton really doing amazing work, both those of Caribbean heritage and also the white people who grew up in the Caribbean community. I'm also glad to call many of these people my colleagues and my friends. This is the legacy of MFM. I couldn't fit them all on one slide. Also to include people like Jacob Braithwaite, Park Hugh, the Ivor Johnson Band, and also Lou Angel, whose dad Phil ran the electronics, and his son Chris Bass runs the sound system I Till Lion, which Lee actually raised in my interview with him. Mystic Crew started at MFM practicing in their basement from 1988. The founding of Jar Troopers Sound in 1998 followed, Narissa Simone, Krista Morrison, Afrini, amid other black and black mixed artists probably wouldn't be able to play in the way they do today. MFM and bands like Mystic Crew hadn't knocked down those doors previously, which also made it a lot easier for me as a poet, as a spoken word artist. I think I too owe my poetry career in Northampton to movement, even though I didn't know that until recently. Local activist, entrepreneur, and curator, Shireen Ingram, as well, further to Ashley Mackenzie and team at Restoration Sound, sitting in the legacy of MFM and Count Shelley. Numbers to striving for something more and to be part of something bigger than themselves. At Movement, it wasn't about winning against the system, but showing what was possible. While I know I haven't covered everything, I truly hope this talk has done some little justice, this organisation, and taken the Salvation Army Citadel in 77 became a metaphor for the good and the dangerous times that defined many Northamptonians for their generation. Thank you very much. And like the rest of my videos, if you've got things to say, comments, just leave it in the comment section. Or if you want to if you have memories of MFM that you want to share, as I'm still writing my PhD, you can send them to me by email. So you can contact, and or we can arrange to meet up, and I can interview you like I've interviewed quite a number of other people as well. Um, but yeah, that's the end of this talk. And if you want to see anything else about Northamptonshire Black history, let me know. Thank you very much.